Welcome everyone to this GCNC webinar. I am one of the co-founders of the GCNC, Jill Reddish, and we're coming to you today with a really interesting discussion about the science of smokability. The really incredible phase 1 study was done on examining the impact of water activity on cannabis flower, and I'm so pleased to be joined by a whole crew of folks, including some of the scientists who conducted the study, and a couple amazing folks from the business side of things who will be able to share perspectives about the implications of this amazing work. So first, I want to give a quick shout out to Emerald Lane Recruitment, who is one of the key sponsors for the GCNC, and with their support, we're able to produce and create this webinar to help get this important scientific information out there to everybody. So Emerald Lane Recruitment, founded by Stephanie Powell, and they focus on recruitment and HR management. And we're so pleased to be working with them and to have their support. With the GCNC, we have members in the cannabis business all over the world and all over the supply chain. So we get a really unique perspective of all of the innovative work that's happening out there and all of the disruption, as well as the science and research proving out the things that many of us know and have observed in working with the cannabis flower. So today I'm really excited to dive into this study, which proves out some really helpful, interesting things that we all need to understand about the science of smokability. So first, I'll start us off with a round of introductions, and then we'll move into the meat of our content today. So Dr. Allison Justice, will you start us off with introductions? Tell us a little bit about who you are and who you work with also.
Yeah, I'm Allison Justice. I'm a plant scientist by training. I founded the Cannabis Research Center and Coalition, and we are a open source organization that does contract research, again, horticultural research, but also a lot of post-harvest research. My specialty with Miyabe, who I'm thinking you'll meet next, combining our specialties along with other authors in this journal, Dr. Riley Kirk, Dr. Marcus Rogan. We combined our specialties to really hit this project the way we wanted to, and so hopefully we'll get into that in a little bit.
I love hearing about a meeting of the minds. Exactly. All right, and Dr. Miyabe Shields, will you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Miyabe Shields. I am a co-founder of the Network of Applied Pharmacognosy. We are a nonprofit that studies natural medicines. Pharmacognosy is the precursor of pharmaceutical sciences, and that is my specialty. I've been researching the endocannabinoid system and lipid signaling systems for the past 15 years, including being in a stint in the industry where I did more analytical on the heat transformation of cannabinoids at temperature in relevant to smoking, vaping, any sort of combustion, partial pyrolysis. And so Allison's expertise is growing of the plants, everything having to do with processing and understanding how we can optimize all of the variables there. And what I'm here to talk about has to do with how that translates into chemistry and how there are differences of how that could change the way that it works for us mechanistically, and the quality of smoking, and why high quality smokable flower is something that medical and rec markets should be concerned with and should ultimately prioritize.
Love it. Thank you so much. Thank you. All right, and then next up, Dr. Jordan Tishler.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jordan Tishler, and I'm a physician. So my focus has been on patient care for the last 15 or so years. I'm also the founder and president of the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists, which is an international not-for-profit that focuses on educating clinicians on what we know about cannabis as medicine and how to help patients with that, as well as to focus on shall we say, educating lawmakers and policymakers so that we can develop processes and policies that better support patient outcomes.
Love it. So the very big picture of the whole medical side of things. Love that. Thank you for being here. Okay, and then going on more onto the industry side of things, where I'm pleased to be joined by David Vaillencourt. Sorry.
Hey, Jill and everybody. Yes. So good to see you all. David Vaillencourt. So I wear a few different hats in this space. I'm really honored to be here. I've got my consulting firm, GMP Collective, that I founded in 2018, and we help folks develop and implement industry standards and best practices to make their operations financially viable and sustainable. And a lot of that led me to the creation of solving a major gap in the industry that we'll get to talk about today, which is the creation of voluntary consensus standards. So I am the vice chairman of the ASTM International Committee, D37 on cannabis, and I am also the board chairman of the S3 Collective, which is a nonprofit that works with organizations that are here, like Jordan's, Claire, and the Cannabis Research Coalition and others. We're a 501c3 nonprofit focusing on bridging the gap and all those big picture pieces between the standards, the science, and the safety. We're grateful to be part of the FDA's network of experts program. So we're the only nonprofit 501c3 organization that is part of that network of experts program that allows us to provide guidance and advising to the FDA on the cannabis and cannabinoids generally. So we're here to help connect all of those gaps and, of course, help folks here today understand the importance of water activity, which, fun fact, was the first industry standard, or I shouldn't even say industry standard, consensus standard ever created for the cannabis industry.
I love a good fun fact. Thank you. I didn't even know that. All right, and to round out our crew today, we have Claire Erikson joining us from Boveda. Hey, Claire.
Hi, good morning, everybody. You guys, it's such a privilege to be invited into this conversation. So, number one, thank you, Jill, for hosting, to you, Chris, and the GCNC, and thank you, everybody else, for joining and allowing us to sit in on the conversation. I'm Claire Erikson, Industry Programs Manager at Boveda. Boveda has been in the business of two-way humidity control for 28 years. So we have a long history with managing moisture and managing quality in boutique industries such as premium cigars, guitars, and now cannabis. So my role specifically is really centered around strategic integration. So taking that broad view through the long lens of the whole caniscape and making sure, that we're supporting the conversations and the work that's leading to the best quality outcomes for number one, patients, number two, consumers, and then down the supply chain from there. So just happy to be here and support where we can.
Thank you, Claire. I love the collaboration that Boveda models throughout the industry. That is such a huge thing for the GCNC as well. And so I'm just beyond excited about how interdisciplinary this webinar is. That's something that I just always personally love. And the plant, of course, touches so many different things. So without further ado, let's kind of really dive into it. I want to first level set by offering up to the folks who are listening a quick definition of what is water activity. Dr. Justice, Allison, would you give us a quick, answer that question, the what is water activity?
Absolutely. So water activity is a metric that's used not just in cannabis, but it's used in the food industry. So we could be talking about the water activities of gummies or raisins. But to back up a little bit and to make it relevant to the conversation today, I think it's important to understand two definitions. So you cut the plant and you dry it. And, that's the most important step for water weight management, for safety. But we have to define that somehow with a tool. When is dry just right? And so there's two methods to do that, right? You can do water content, which is the total amount of water in that product. It could be flour, it could be gummy, whatever you have it. moisture content. And so if you're a cultivator, you might be really interested in that number because that equates to your weight, your actual weight that you're selling. But to move it a bit to the safer side, if we use another metric, which only determines not just that, it discludes the bound water that's within cells that's actually held on to that plant, and it measures that free available water which microbes can grow on. And so we call that water activity. And so that's a different device we use to measure water contents, usually a percentage, and then water activity is a scale from 0 to 1.
Great. Okay. And so I heard two important things, that weight equals money when we're talking on the business side. And the presence of water, I heard you say microbes, and microbes they're all over, but there's a lot of ones that we don't want present there on our weeds. So that's going to lead us to safety, which we're definitely going to be addressing throughout this webinar. So starting with that basic definition, let's get into the study. Like what was the question that you guys wanted to answer, and how did you structure going about answering and kind of proving out the answer to that question?
I can start by just saying that there were several questions that are imminent that still need to be answered, but this was kind of what we're coming across as like, this is something that very clearly is a part of a quality metric of smokable flower that we don't have any data existing on how it affects all of these other metrics, including smokability. And when we as a group got together, one of the things that we were really passionate about understanding was just what does and what can we do to define quality, because ultimately right now quality in the industry, part of it is being driven by like marketing and like what it can look like and what we're saying about it. And also people seem to equate it with THC concentration, which is not true and is a huge problem and a growing problem for specifically for medical patients. A lot of people who have a lot of experience with flower. I've been researching cannabis and the endocannabinoid system for 15 years, but I've been a consumer for 20 years plus. And those of us who know flower, prefer flower, and love flower understand all the different metrics of quality, and water activity and that as a component is something that comes up because dry and things that are dry, they smoke differently, and that is something that leads to different chemical formulations. It leads to a whole bunch of number of different things. So this was really just the first step when our group got together of being like, what can we look at as a metric to define pieces of this experience that have never been quantified before that go into the overall experience is important. And one thing I just want to mention about smoking and about it being a topic that is unique to cover from this aspect of like even looking into the chemical diversity is part of why smoking cannabis isn't looked at this way, and part of why it's so difficult to study this way has to do with the fact that we don't recommend people to smoke as a medical intervention. And that medically, Dr. Jordan Tishler and I were talking briefly before this, that medically that is not what we would be saying, but it does remain true that while we're not recommending that as the safest metric, it is the most common use and a large market space for cannabis. And so understanding this from the scientific perspective was really important. And we worked with a bunch of different other groups and collaborators to help us establish what we were looking at. The Ganjiers were a component of us discussing what things we were testing for sensory wise. And we had a few additional things that we were looking at ourselves. But one of the reasons why we found that looking into the quality and looking into the experience of it, in addition to what happened chemically and what we were able to quantify, is a way to link the value that this could have. Because let's just say that we could recommend all day that medical patients take edibles, but for a fact, some people can't feel them, and it doesn't work for a certain population of people. And for a fact, a certain population of people don't like them. And I'm just so not alone there with that. Not to say that I wouldn't love to have the reproducibility of an edible and a longer duration of an edible. I would love that, but it does not give me the therapeutic benefit that I need. And it is fairly common.
Sorry, there's such an aspect of dealing with the reality of the situation that flower is one of the most commonly used ways for people to ingest cannabis, which we kudos, right, in terms of acknowledging the reality of the situation. And so the question like trying to be answered here is, what is the actual level of water activity present in the plant that leads to a good smoking experience, right? Something there. But then
The
also like
highest, yeah, the
what is
highest
good?
quality, like the highest quality, right? I mean, and a piece of the quality being the experience, because if something is irritating or irritable, is not smooth, that experience drives the effects too. I know that we talk about psychedelics with set and setting, and that isn't often brought up in cannabis, but especially with flower, the responses to flower are not as reproducible, and a component of that has to do with variability in the experience. So this was something that all of us we're hoping to link together for the first time is components of that with the actual chemistry and with the water activity and with other types of analyses that we could eventually do future studies. And this is water activity was kind of one of the first things, ash color is something that we had people self-report on, and that has been an industry, I mean, I don't know if it's been, we could call it an industry slash all industry market agree like a controversial topic about ash color and quality, and there are things that we wanted to find answers to that I think deserve have answers to about what is the highest quality smokable flower and how can our industry represent that, and how can we as scientists help give metrics that help us to represent highest quality.
All right, so for the study, like what actually happened? Of a whole bunch of people who are experienced smokers were recruited, and what were they asked to do and to report on?
Yep. So the study was broke down two ways, right? We can call it qualitative and quantitative. So for the quantitative portion, we had a smoking machine, and so imagine a box that hooks to a computer, and it's a little robot that smokes for you ultimately. And you're able to collect that smoke, condense it down, and then be able to see, well, this is what was in the flower, as their said molecules, and this is what happens after combustion and what actually hits the lungs. So we were able to take that and to see not only conversions that happen because of the heat, but also quantities and what's left behind. So we had that portion where we're seeing these differences, and then we also had that qualitative portion where we have our three treatments being high, low, and medium.
Levels of water.
Right. So 0.45 being the lowest, really under the point that most commercial growers or users would want to use, dry, very dry. But that was the purpose of this study, was to start somewhere and start with a broad net, cast your net, see what those extremes are, and then narrow down from there. So our highest water activity was 0.85. Keep in mind the scales from 0 to 1. So that's really wet, wetter than anybody would want to sell, wetter than what is recommended for microbial, stopping microbial growth. But again, we wanted to start with extreme ranges. And then 0.65 being right there at commercially acceptable, being our middle range. And so for the qualitative smoking portion, we actually took these pre-rolls, got them to their proper water activity, quadruple sealed them, and then sent them out for participants. And we didn't send out the 0.85 just because that could certainly be dangerous. But we did use that on the smoking machine. And so Miyabe put together a very nice instructional video for the users to understand, all the proper steps that where, everybody's being as consistent as possible with taking the questionnaire and reporting what they're experiencing.
Oh yeah, I can imagine that's a real challenge, getting the consistency when you're just sending something out and hoping people can be consistent and self-report. Yeah. Okay, so folks tell me a little bit more about what information you were looking for from the consumers and after they were smoking. Like what were some of the questions that they were reporting back to you on?
Yeah, I can answer. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Allison.
No, go for it.
Okay, I was gonna say that just going back to the ash color one, we actually sent out a card that had a color scale on there just to see to report what people's visuals were on that. And we did notice that there was a difference in the reported ash color between the water treatments, which makes sense because of temperature changes and such. But most of it was focused on the experience, like sensory experiences of cannabis, and then also like mouthfeel. And something that I think that people who don't have a lot of experience smoking flower don't understand is the difference of all the different aspects of smoking. And this also plays into the difference of the different types of smoking, right? Like out of a bowl, a bong, a joint, or a blunt, like it's going to be different. And so we were looking at different aspects of sensory evaluations for like aroma preferences and taste profiles, but also differences in the way that it would feel. And the reason why this is kind of intriguing to me, just as a side note, as a pharmacologist, is that the receptor in your mouth that's responsible for the tingly and for capsaicin and for spicy mouthfeel is related to the endocannabinoid system and very, very closely related and signals well with CB1 receptor. It's called the TRPV1 receptor. And that was one of the metrics that we were looking at for mouthfeel. And that's something in the future to be interesting to look into with other strains like Durban strains that have mouthfeel. And there are aspects of the smoking experience that we were looking to quantify that have to do with enjoyability and then also having to do with potentially what is in the smoke or characteristics of the smoke.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so obviously when your cannabis is at kind of the optimal level for everything, you're going to get the best experience of that plant can deliver in terms of the terpenes and the cannabinoids, and you're going to get kind of the best experience when everything is optimized with the flower. Just to explain it to a 6-year-old for a second, right?
Yeah, so we're trying to figure out what optimize is. Because it's not, as we saw in this study, it's not just water activity that's affecting these different metrics. That's a big one, especially with delivery, but it's not the only. And also just to clarify a little more, if you haven't been able to read the study, we did standardize with 1 gram pre-rolls. So they were all 1 gram pre-rolls, whether we were using on the machine or with a participant. And then there's one other thing I was going to mention. Oh, and they were blinded to which was which. They didn't know until after the fact.
And so excuse me, let's get into the results. I think we were with this study, you all were able to prove out what the industry has kind of gleaned is a more optimal water level, but from this, there's some actual reproducibility and there's some actual standards and proof points against the preferred level of water activity, right? Can you tell us a little bit about the results, essentially?
Yeah, I think to me, probably the most eye-opening piece, which eye-opening, but also it's kind of a duh situation where the one that was very wet, difficult to light, difficult to stay lit. It delivered significantly less, total cannabinoids, as well as less total terpenes. The lowest water activity was the second lowest as far as delivery, and what we've basically been operating on as an industry being that 0.65, that had the best delivery when smoking with the smoking machine.
Yeah. Okay. So at this point, I'd like to turn to Dr. Jordan Tishler. Hearing some of these comments for, optimal delivery, especially with patients in mind, what are the takeaways that you are getting from this, and how might this be changing conversations that you have with patients, especially those who do prefer, as Miyabe pointed out, so many medical patients still really prefer flower. So what are your comments here?
Well, I think, it's a very interesting study, and I think I want to say on record that it's an incredibly well done study, and that in many ways to Dr. Justice's point, it may have proved the duh point, but it's good to have that proven. And what I got out of this is a number of things. First of all, the really wet stuff. It not only is not good for the delivery of the cannabinoids, but clearly it's not a safe product for marketing. And so that's good that we understand that that's not where we want to be. It's also interesting that the drier stuff was not as good at delivering the medicinal chemicals as we would expect. Why is this relevant? Well, to some degree, and the degree of variation is important, but really when we sit down with patients and we start to develop a dosing regimen, we want to be able to be specific, right? And so when I work with my patients, will be able to tell them, that you need a strain that has a certain percentage, for example, of THC in it, and that by using generally, I say vaporizer that in a particular manner, then we can be quantitative or at least semi-quantitative about the dose that they're getting. And that's useful for things like tracking how they're doing over time, as well as occasionally converting people's regimens to and from oral delivery. So the water activity may actually be influencing that part of the conversation. And so it may be not as simple going forward as saying you need a strain that has, say, 20% THC in it, because you may actually need to specify 20% with a certain water activity so that those calculations are in fact accurate and reproducible. And I think that one of the really interesting questions that wasn't addressed in this study, but actually is probably on the to-do list coming thereafter, is, this focused really on smoking, on combustion. And as Dr. Shields said, and I would say, is that smoking is certainly the most prevalent, but not necessarily the optimal way of taking by inhalation. And I would not in any way, shape, or form say inhalation isn't important. It's very important. So how do we do it better? Well, the way we do it better is by flower vaporization. So it'd be very interesting to see in the next study whether these results for water activity have the same influence on flower vaporization as they do on combustion. And so I think that that's really the next step that occurs to me, and I think it's going to influence our discussions with patients.
Absolutely. And I love something that's so wonderful about science is that every question you do get answered leads to more questions. So I look forward to hosting the next webinar when we address that next question about vaporizing. So for now, based off of the results from this study, let's turn a little bit into the industry and the business side of things. So David, I'd like to hear from you about I kind of want to start just first with what was the most exciting thing to you about this study? What from the results made you go, okay, let's go, let's do something?
Well, I think the duh moment is like so on point where, I think about, so let me take a half step back with like industry standards and like consensus standards generally. And they're market relevant. That's what makes them so valuable. And that doesn't always mean that they're the most scientifically like technical or accurate. And I don't mean that in a bad way. To give you an example for folks to consider, like tomato is technically a fruit, but nobody goes to the grocery store and looks in the fruit section or talks about the tomato being a fruit. We call it a vegetable. I'd say that's a perfect example of like where it's a market relevant standard that we call tomatoes a vegetable, even though it's scientifically a fruit. So looking at that though, what do we have here? We have a market relevant standard. This standard, D81, 96, and 97, which, go write that down and then Google it after so you can make sure that you know the standard that you should all be adhering to, wasn't based on this type of research. It was based on knowledge, previous research around, water activity for safety of microbial growth. And this is the first ASTM standards I mentioned at the beginning. And now it's stood the test of time. And not only that, but the duh point that we've all talked about and believed to be true has now been confirmed by research that it's actually the most optimal quality. And that is that the ASTM standard specifies that water activity shall be between 0.55 and 0.65. Why a range? Because ranges are your friend, I like to say. We're not going to nail this precision of 0.65 every time. We can do that in scientific research, but we can't replicate that in the real world. We can't go above 0.65 because that's where the microbial risk comes in. So what's the limit to go down below? Well, as we get closer to 0.45, as the study findings showed, it's not as bad as 0.85 in terms of the smokability, the quality, but it's not as optimal as 0.65. And so what this shows is so profound that we care about the entourage effect. That's what, Dr. Tischler and the physicians are looking for, not just the THC value for quality. Now we can say that if you conform to this ASTM consensus standard, that the research shows they're going to have the best quality in terms of like smokability and impact on your lungs and feeling in your throat, and you're also going to get the most amount of terpenes, those secondary chemical compounds and constituents that modulate and add to the medical benefits of this plant. So this is huge.
Yeah, as I have to say, as a cannabis consumer who lives in Denver, which is notoriously very dry, um, this is sparking so many thoughts for me about the times where I buy some flour and it has that Colorado crumble, and I just know like, oh, I know I'm missing out on terpenes when I'm smoking this. And I get really excited when I get some flour where I can just tell this is optimal. Like it still has that sticky icky kind of thing. And it brings me more joy in addition to probably a really optimal experience. I think that's so, and I love knowing that there's numbers attached to this. I love knowing that somebody else gets to worry about the numbers so that I, as a, consumer at the end of my day, I don't have to worry about the numbers so much.
Yeah, and Jill, just briefly to add, and Claire, you may or may not know, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I believe there's been a lot of research that's looked at the lab results of flour that's out in the marketplace, and it falls somewhere between zero point 0.4 and 0.45. And so that's a lot lower than what we're talking about here. So there's a major room for opportunity in the marketplace for producers to, whether it's using the Boveda packs or whatnot, to control the water activity after it dries and cures and sits on the shelves, whether we're in dry Colorado, or humid Florida, to ensure that this optimal water activity preserves the terps.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's so interesting. Claire, please
yeah,
jump on
David,
in.
no, great point. Great point for sure. At Boveda, we do a ton of water activity testing because that's the business we're in. That's our whole value claim, right? Is we provide the most precise two-way humidity control out there. So we're constantly testing, going into the marketplaces in various jurisdictions, and that's in the United States and around the world. So, we're operating globally and looking at these numbers. So for us, seeing the outcomes and the results of the study that really affirm, the tribal wisdom about drying and curing cannabis within kind of that zero point 0.6 range, and then storing it over time to the ASTM D8197 standard, it feels really good for us. And it's, David, to your point, I think, um, it's encouraging that we now have this third party and peer reviewed research that backs up that wisdom, right? So it's like offering a gift to businesses, to patients, to consumers to say, hey, if you want the best, this is part of how you can achieve it. So broadly in the marketplace, back to the point here, um, we've seen flour as low as like zero point 0.2 water activity. And we've also seen it, run the full gamut, um, up above the 0.65. So something we need to be clear on too is that 0.65 is the upper limit for water activity. So all those microbes that we wouldn't want to be ingesting and the funguses and things that can grow on cannabis, they start above 0.65. So 0.65 is really the maximum water activity that you would want to store your cannabis to. And that's affirmed through several organizations. ASTM, David, which you're doing a great job guiding and leading, the practical work over at ASTM. We've also recently seen NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, jump into the conversation. And they've recently approved a standard, the water activity standard, into their weights and measures handbook. So we now have, an entity that's tied to the federal government affirming the value of water activity from a weight and consumer fairness and economic standpoint. USP is another example of an organization that's saying, yes, water activity between 0.5 and 0.65 is really the best place to hold and store that cannabis flower.
I'm hearing consensus here across the industry, which feels like a moment to celebrate, quite honestly. So that's fantastic. And Claire, I'd love to hear more from you, drilling down, like, well, kind of connecting the dots about, we mentioned at the beginning, we just touched on how water activity um, impacts weight and that impacts dollars for cultivators and for businesses. Can you speak a little bit more about that and your perspective from Boveda in partnering with cultivators in ensuring that from the field to my couch, people are getting the optimal experience.
Sure. So at the end of the day, we don't have an industry if it's not economically viable, right? Producers and farmers have to be able to make money off of their product. So there are a lot of side conversations we can have, in the regulatory space about that. But water activity and moisture management is one of those items that is just common sense across the board. So, and it doesn't start with the consumer going and buying a pre-roll that's been stored at the very end with a moisture management tool like Boveda, right? It starts at the beginning, after that drying and curing phase, and making sure that that flower, that the moisture, the water activity is maintained all the way from the bulk storage all the way through the supply chain to the end consumer. So, something interesting about this study too, and what I truly loved about it was really the multi-pronged approach that they took to defining and identifying the value of water activity, right? We can look at the posology, the dosing, the cannabinoids, the terpenes. We look at the qualitative smoke, right? If you have a patient that is maybe having an acute event or some breakthrough through pain, like we don't want to make their condition worse by having them ingest something that is harmful and harsh, right? We want them to have a good experience. But then they also took it a step further and looked at the economics of it, right? So essentially, and Allison and Miyabe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in this specific study, they found that you can earn by storing, within that ASTM defined range for water activity, up to like $30 more per pound of your cannabis. And at Boveda, tests that we've done using information from the field, we found that that number actually can increase up to like $75 per pound. So when you're thinking about like a big operation and moving a lot of flour in mass, I mean, that adds up. So truly, water activity control, it's a quality attribute of cannabis, it's a safety attribute of cannabis, and it's also like economically makes sense.
Yeah, those are huge differences that really matter to the bottom line for so many cultivators and for people all across that supply chain. So that's huge. Um, I want to address one or two of the questions that have come in about. We had a question about if you package flour at the 0.65 level water activity and the product experiences temperature fluctuations. Would the water activity have the possibility of going above that 0.65 level and risk microbial growth? So Claire or David, maybe can you speak to that and how people can mitigate that and ensure consumer safety?
Sure. So just from our perspective, it's the moisture management is only as good as the total packaging system that the flour is encapsulated in. So there are a lot of bags on the market of, glass containers, mylar bags, all different kinds of things. And what is really important is that, you have that good seal, that you have, the right amount of permeability within that packaging. And then using a moisture management, control like Boveda, it's really an insurance policy. So as you're seeing, cannabis move from different environments and experience fluctuations in the outside environment, a tool like Boveda just helps to make sure that that water activity is consistent and you're not going to have any misses where you're risking mold growth or where that's drying out and you're losing water weight. David?
Yeah. Yeah, I think I mean, you nailed it, Claire, right? And it's really important for folks to consider, and I don't want to digress too far from the study, but you have to think about the total supply chain. So you can be the best grower and have an amazing, precise drying process and curing process, but what happens after it leaves? What's the conditions? What's the quality of the packaging, as Claire mentioned? How is it stored and transported? what's happening at the dispensary afterwards? Are they controlling the temperature and humidity in their building? What's happening in the storage? Are you in Florida? Are you in Colorado? Are you in, Malta? Where are you? And what are those environmental conditions? In the pharma world, they do transportation validation. So they send dummy samples to ensure that, they look at the temperature fluctuations. Is your product sitting on the tarmac in Phoenix for 4 hours in the summer? How could that potentially affect the degradation or the spikes of the product's humidity? Those are all really important. And then there's also the stability concept too, right? So is this after 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months? Is the water activity being maintained? And that's a function of the packaging. And we all are used to best by dates and expiration dates in our pharmaceuticals and our food, in our milk and dairy products. We haven't really talked about that a lot in the cannabis industry, but we have to consider that water activity at, say, zero point 0.6 today may not be zero point 0.6 in 6 months, even with the best packaging. So we have to consider our packaging, how we're modulating that, and the environmental factors, and establish that a certain range of, a date consideration to ensure that the product should be used by.
Yeah, I so many things that you touched on there in terms of the logistics and the reality of, time from being in the field or the greenhouse to getting to someone's couch. There can be a lot of time, a lot of travel there. I mentioned how I love how interdisciplinary this webinar is. This is touching so many different things, and it's an interesting kind of complex question to be solving too in so many ways. One thing that I want to call out, in reviewing the summary for this study, we've touched on how this water activity is impacting the dollars that the cultivator is getting, the experience for the consumer, but also we haven't even touched on like the dollars that the cultivator gets also touches on how much tax revenue that governments get. And, we might think that this is, water activity in a lab, but it is also impacting policy and incentives for governments to move forward with supporting and opening up access to cannabis, both for medical patients and just for adult use. So I love how incredibly multifaceted and big picture this study really is. So that being said, we're kind of winding down on our time, and I would love to revisit each of our panelists. You all have such different roles here. I'd love to hear just kind of a final thought, or kind of final key takeaway from this study from each of you. And I think I'll kind of work a little bit backwards. David, I kind of want to put you on the spot. Can I start with you? What's your final kind of key takeaway and things that you would want people to really remember from this?
Yeah, so I thought about this going into this webinar of like, how do you like summarize this? Like, less is more. And I think about it as around what it represents: quality, which aroma is a function of, and safety and value. And it hits on those 4 points quite well, that to have a safe, quality, valuable product, you need to conform to this ASTM standard, and the research confirms that. And I think that's really significant for folks to recognize. So looking at all that in totality and doubling down on the value of the ASTM standards, and there are standards beyond just the water activity standards. So when we were talking about this transportation issue and the supply chain and storage logistics, there are standard specifications for how to manage for what ranges of temperature and humidity these products should be contained in. And I forget the exact numbers and names of those standards, but you can Google them on ASTM, or we can talk about them another time. That brings this whole suite together.
Absolutely. And I'll just kind of echo the importance and underline the importance of the organizations that are putting together these industry standards and pulling on all of the research that's out there to be able to make the best standards possible and the most relevant standards, because you want the standards to actually be followed, right? Kind of important. Yeah. All right. Claire, I'd love to hear from you about a key takeaway.
Yeah, from my perspective and from the Boveda perspective, I think the findings just they underscore the need for these standardized metrics for cannabis quality. And Doctors Justice and Shields talked about that at the beginning of the conversation. How do we create something that has repeatable, consistent quality, right? And the first step in doing that is defining what quality is for your product. Water activity is a really great starting point for that, right? If we're taking cultivar, our whatever cultivar X, and ensuring that it's between that ASTM standard 0.55 to 0.65, that's something that we can say is part of our quality regime. So I think that's a really good first step that businesses need to focus on. And in the long term, that type of repeatability gives patients and consumers a reason to continue to come back to the brand and to make repeat purchases. So it's a place for brands to start building that loyalty into their product offering.
That's huge, of course, because we all know with so many products out there that if a consumer has a bad experience or just even a okay experience, they're not that likely to go back to that product and that brand, and it's so much harder to win them back. So starting it off with validated information right off the bat to ensure that the consumer gets the best experience, boom, that's huge. That's huge. So from the medical patient side of things, Dr. Tishler, let's hear about what's your final thoughts here.
Well, I think that this is, again, a really well done, extremely important study that really does influence our understanding of quality. And, from the medical point of view, the fact that we've now defined what is too much water, what is too little water, and that have with the too much water, it's fairly obvious what sorts of repercussions there may be. With too little water, we've sort of now defined that, in fact, the delivery of the medicine is not as good as it needs to be. And that kind of optimization really helps take care of patients. And I'm very interested in the next step so that we can look at, excuse me, how water activity influences other safer approaches to inhalation, like the vaporization that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I can imagine it must be pretty exciting for you as an MD talking to patients in getting any bit more of research about how to make smoking as safe as possible for them.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as therapeutic as possible, which I think is really to the point on the lower end of the water scale.
Love that. Exactly. Not only safe, but therapeutic and effective as well. Thank you. Thank you for being here. And so circling back to where we started with the creators of the study, Dr. Allison Justice and Dr. Miyabe Shields. Allison, let's hear from you first about your takeaway, because I'd love to save Miyabe's thoughts for the final wrap up.
Yeah, so I coming from a standpoint of a production manager or a cultivator, I think it's extremely important not only for the one controlling, ultimately the controls of when your product's drying, finished drying. I think it's really important to dig into the textbooks and really understand the physics and be able to answer the questions that were presented today in this webinar. And what does it mean if the temperature rises? Does this change my water activity? It's very complicated. It's physics, psychometric maps you need to look at, but it's something very important, and that each step along the way also needs to have a handle on how to achieve this number and how to stay at that number. I just want to take the opportunity as well to say thank you for having us on the show. Thank you for everybody else being on here with us. We love getting our research out. There's too much to do. We want to do vaporizers and vapes and, look at all the pieces that go into the cultivation part, right? Because, spending hours and hours looking through tobacco research to understand, they've put a lot of money and time into making a cigarette as smooth as possible. There's additives put into that, and there's things that are told to cultivators to not do because it'll make the smoke not as smooth, or it will increase your chance of toxins to be produced from combustion. So there's just so much to look at, but we're definitely going to keep continuing this as long as we possibly can. So thanks for sharing it for us.
Thank you. Yeah, every thread we pull on leads to more to go find out about. Thank you for that. All right, Miyabe, will you bring us home with your final thoughts for today?
Yeah, absolutely. My final thoughts from this study were that, I was also very excited to see the whole big duh moment that we all saw, is that there is inherent knowledge here that already exists, that it is good to put numbers behind for quality, for reproducibility, and for the industry to prioritize it. And right now, the industry is dealing with an uneducated general public because of the prohibition and the ongoing prohibition. Of that, the only people who have this education are people seeking it out, and that we actually only legally educate people after they're 21, when the reality is most people are exposed to cannabis far before that. And the other reality is that I was sort of, my research career has taken a different role since I became an advocate and since I've been connected with so many medical patients. And there are things that we all have in common. And the quality of flower being variable is a huge issue for us generally across the board. It's a huge issue for people who need to be able to make recommendations and rely upon the similar effects that happen. And so it's really exciting to see the beginnings of this happening, and that we got to involve the community in the process. We got to have people who are medical consumers be invested and tell us about their experiences, because one thing that this paper does show is that the amount of information and a lot of those standards and some of the reasons why we feel that way about cannabis quality comes from the legacy and comes from how cannabis has been dried, cured, and stored since then. And that inherent knowledge has come from community, and that information is valuable and actually is immediately impactful in the industry and how we can have higher quality. Because ultimately, having an uneducated public and then just pushing things from a lack of understanding, like I can say that like a huge amount of product in the market is great. A huge amount of product in the market is too dry. And that's a very easy fix, to not have too dry product that then also has differences in the concentrations because water weight, et cetera, all the things that we've been talking about on this panel. So I'm super appreciative to have been on here and had this chat, and to be able to do this research with Allison and Riley and Marcus and Ashley and our SOS team. Like, it's been the beginning of things. And actually, like, just to tease the things that we're working on, we actually, in the process, when Allison and Riley, Dr. Riley Kirk, were testing these on the smoke machine, we realized that the protocols and procedures that were being used are from tobacco research, and that there needs to be and should be differential things going on, and that we should be evaluating that ourselves too. And so there's all these other questions that this opens up, and I think it's really, I'm really excited about it. And I think that it was a big duh moment, but it was really nice and validating to hear. And I know a lot of people who've been operating for a long time with those standards, and I'm sure it was nice for them to hear too.
That was such a great point to end on, Miyabe. Thank you so much to you and all of the panelists for being here today and for all of the incredible work that you're doing. With that, we'll go ahead and wrap up this webinar highlighting this new research validating water activity from the Phase 1 Science of Smokability study. This recording will be available on the GCNC website at gcnc.global and our YouTube channel, just search GCNC, where we'll also be providing a link to the full study so you can read more. Thank you everyone for watching, and we hope you have a wonderful day.